Progress after this was not so easy. Russians manning newly built T-34 tanks that had just rolled off the production line launched stinging counterattacks on the Germans. By the 13th of September, the Russians had retreated from the outer suburbs into the city centre, where the panzers had no advantage. A two-pronged attack by the Germans, supported by Stukas, aimed for strategic targets in the city centre. The next few days would see ground taken and then lost, only to be recaptured again. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, or War of the Rats. The Luftwaffe found it impossible to pinpoint targets in the narrow streets, and while air raids destroyed the buildings, the Russians took cover in the cellars. The next few days would see fighting from street to street, house to house, even room to room. The battlefront could be a corridor between burnt-out rooms or the ceiling between two floors. They fought with guns, knives, clubs, or whatever objects came to hand. This was war at its most primitive. The Russians are not men, but indestructible devils, wrote one infantryman. We will never see Germany again. Slowly, the Sixth Army advanced until they held the city centre. But the vast industrial area to the north was still held by the Russians. The Germans also faced artillery bombardment from the other side of the Volga River. Another danger for the Germans was Russian snipers. One Russian named Vasily Zaitsev killed 242 Germans. On the 14th of October, the Germans launched a major offensive on the industrial area. Over the next 2 weeks, the Germans advanced until they held 90% of the city. The remainder offered no strategic advantage, but the Germans desperately needed a victory, and Hitler declared, "No power on earth will force us out of Stalingrad." But the triumphant conquerors of Stalingrad were about to face destruction. The Red Army was massing troops and armor for a devastating counterattack. By the 19th of November, winter had set in, and an icy mist enveloped the city. Then, as the mist lifted, it revealed screaming Romanian troops fleeing a massive advance by the Russians. At 7:20 a.m., the Soviets unleashed a furious artillery barrage. Then the tanks of the Soviet 5th and 21st Armies advanced towards the city. 500,000 troops followed behind, commanded by Major General Nikolai Vatutin. The Romanian armies were defeated within 24 hours. But it soon became clear that the Soviets were not attacking the city, but heading northeast and southwest, ironically using the very tactics of the Germans against them. The trap sprang shut on the 23rd of November, leaving 22 German divisions, some 250,000 men trapped. The Stalingrad Kessel, or Cauldron as it was called, saw the Germans put on the defensive and fighting for their very survival. Any thoughts of retreat were dismissed by Hitler. Göring insisted he could keep the troops supplied from the air. But like so many of Göring's promises, it was just not possible. Over the next few weeks, the besieged Germans would start dying of hunger, and attacks by the Russians would kill many, many more. They were too weak to break out of the encirclement. An attempt to reach Sixth Army by a Panzer Corps was forced back by stiff Soviet resistance. By January, the Russians were massing troops to take the city by force. An offer to surrender was made to Paulus, but Hitler decreed Sixth Army should fight to the death. During January, the Soviet divisions set about destroying the remaining German divisions. Hitler stated, "The troops will defend their positions to the last. The Sixth Army has thus made a historic contribution in the most gigantic war effort in German history." Paulus was promoted to Field Marshal, but on the 31st of December, he allowed himself to be captured by the Soviets. The German survivors were harshly treated by their captors, a fate that was in store for millions of Germans over the next few years. From then on, the Red Army rolled forward. Occasionally, a counterattack would halt their advance, but by March it was clear that the Germans stood no chance on the Eastern Front. Hitler decided that an attempt should be made to halt the Russians. There was a bulge in the German lines around the Kursk area, and these Soviet forces would be encircled and destroyed in Operation Zitadelle, or Citadel. The Russians had learned of these plans, and the stage was set for the largest tank battle in history. At 3:30 p.m. on the 5th of July, German artillery roared into action, firing into the Soviet lines. The battle had begun. Eight days later, the Germans had not achieved their objectives. The gamble at Kursk had not paid off. And to make matters worse, the Allies had landed on Sicily. The tide had inexorably turned. From here on in, the Soviets would maintain their offensive, and the Germans would eventually end up retreating all the way to Berlin.